Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 147. And this episode, we're doing it again. We're going to start from the beginning and go all the way through because we're talking about replayability.
This was an idea that came to me when I was actually thinking about a game I am playing right now. I'm playing through Jedi Survivor as of when we're recording this, though I'll probably be done with it by the time you're hearing it. And thinking about the things that are in this game that people are saying makes it replayable, the collectibles, the customizations, things like that. And it made me think, well, what does that word mean to us, to the broader games industry, and then to like us as aging people who play video games. I was going to say the G word, but I was like, let's find another way to say it. And so, yeah, and for me, where this starts from is like, obviously, replaying games is a thing we do almost as a result of not having a choice as kids, right? You have three games for the Nintendo. You're playing those three games till you get a fourth game, and so on, until we get adults who can be dumb and spend money on too many things.
How dare you?
You kind of just have to replay stuff, right? Because otherwise you have nothing to play. And I think that's where like my earliest memories of thinking about replaying games came from, is like, well, I'm going to replay Duck Hunt because it's fun to play. There's no real story per se, I guess. And like I can just keep playing it because it's a fun arcadey thing.
And I think the arcadey part is really the crux of that, certainly in the NES days. Even if we had access to all sorts of games at our fingertips at that age, the design philosophy was far more steeped in the arcades, if only because of the fact that you couldn't fit an 80-hour RPG epic into 40 kilobytes, however big your NES ROMs are. And so the idea of replaying a game, is that reaching the credits, or is that just essentially popping in another quarter for what the game is? And something I was thinking about is, a funny thing about my spouse is she does not like to re-experience media. She doesn't reread books. She doesn't rewatch movies. She doesn't rewatch TV shows. She understands why people do, but it's a thing for her where it's just, but I've already done this. Why would I do it again?
Right.
The concept of New Game Plus is anathema to her. She's just, why would I do that? I've beaten the game. You bring your stats over. Yeah, I got those stats. I'm done now. But things with a bit more of an arcade feel to them, she will play. She understands that. It's not a philosophical thing. It's emotional. She's also a huge pinball fan. So those same things like Duck Hunt, anything with a short playtime or that set 'em up, knock 'em down kind of feel, does that count as a replay? Sort of does. But I suppose that's why we're trying to define it now.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting on a good point that arcades are kind of the earliest replayable game, right? Like, I remember the first time you and I played, like, the Simpsons arcade together or the Turtles 2 arcade game together, and we're like, we finished it in a half hour, and I'm like, well, this seems strange. I was like, I feel like it took forever as a kid, but the reality is you just replayed it a lot. It was harder. You needed quarters, whereas when you have unlimited continues, that stuff goes fast. Right. And I think there is some inherent game design in especially arcades of like, how do we make this loop so people can keep playing it forever and want to keep going back to it? You think about the original Donkey Kong, and like once you beat the game, it just loads you back into the beginning and you go through it again. And like, I think that I was always aware of that kind of going back and revisiting games. Like the Simpsons game that I mentioned earlier, whenever I would go to the Jersey Shore, there was a deli. I don't remember where the hell it was. They had a Simpsons arcade game there, and my parents, on the way to like set up the house that we were staying at for the weekend, would drop me off there with like roll of quarters and be like, here, have fun, and then come back and get me after I inevitably beat the game. And I did that almost every year for a long time. But like, then again, the kind of first time I was really aware of replaying something is when I had a favorite, and I was simply just replaying it because I liked it, regardless of what the game did to encourage it. But it did have something in it to encourage, which you hinted on, which is New Game Plus. And of course, take a drink. I'm talking about Chrono Trigger. Like, Chrono Trigger is a game that up until maybe 5 or 10 years ago, I used to play at least once a year. I would just play through it, usually the same New Game Plus, since it came out on the DS especially. Like, I would play the same Super Nintendo cartridge until I didn't have a Super Nintendo anymore. And then once the DS version came out, I would replay that one over and over again. And it has a New Game Plus mode. It's not the first, but definitely one of the earliest to have that feature, which allowed you to keep everything you got from the previous run and still replay the game. And like, the game scales up a bit. Certain things are easier, whereas there are other challenges. And that was the first time I went, I am going to replay this game because I love this game so much. And like, I think I had done it with some other Nintendo and Super Nintendo games, but that was the first game on Super Nintendo where I made this like acknowledgement that I was like, this is a thing I want to keep playing.
And the idea that with Chrono Trigger, it wasn't just a matter of you are starting the game again at level 50, level 90, whatever maxed out things you happen to have. Chrono Trigger was a game that advertised all of its different endings.
Right.
And some of them you could not access without cheating or New Game Plus. And so one could argue, are you replaying it or are you continuing your file on the same playthrough to experience those different endings? The same sort of way that when I played through Nier Automata, there's 26 endings in that, and some of them are sequential, some of them are absolutely bonkers. Does it become a thing of, did I complete the game 26 times? No. I think I ended up getting all of the endings eventually. I had to look up how to do a few of them, but I think I did all of them. But I wouldn't call that replaying the game. I would call it thoroughly playing the game. And again, that gets into that weird sort of idea. And I think one of the big divisions, while we were talking about here, like the notion of something like Chrono Trigger versus something like Duck Hunt, I almost look at it like beating Chrono Trigger is rereading a favorite book, like going back to a fantasy novel that you love or something like that. Whereas Duck Hunt is playing a sport.
Right.
You know, the idea of like, why would I want to reread this book? Why would you want to play soccer again? You played soccer last week because soccer's a fun game, because I enjoyed that sport, because whatever that is. You know, why would you play Donkey Kong again? Why would you beat it and then play it again but faster? Because I'm testing my skills. And you are still testing your skills in narrative games, but there are games that you go for because you want to re-experience that narrative, or because there is an experience in playing through the narrative that is super cool to get to, whether those are neat little mini games that happen in the middle of the game, or you play through it again because this is the only way to get to that chapter you really like. Do you want to watch the opera in Final Fantasy VI again? Well, I didn't have that save file. Guess I got to start again.
For sure. And I think we're in the nebulous area of what we consider to be replayability versus what we'll get the industry to think is replayability in a minute. But like in the same vein that when Metroid Dread was announced, I went on a mission to replay all of the Metroid games. Not every single game, but I wanted to play the narrative leading up to the release of Dread, right? I played Zero Mission, Samus Returns Remake. I skipped Super Metroid because I'd played it like the year before. Metroid Fusion, and then Dread when it came out. And like then when they announced that Metroid Fusion was coming this year, I replayed it again. So I've played that game every year already for the last 2 years. We'll see if that continues, but replaying those games has nothing to do with what may or may not be inherent in the design of a Metroidvania that makes them replayable, which there are things.
Yes.
For me, it was, I love this game, I want to replay it. Having said that, I chose not to replay Super Metroid because when I streamed it and replayed it the few years earlier, I struggled with a lot of it. It wasn't impossible, and I was able to get through it. But I remember chunks of the game not being enjoyable just because the controls are still pretty tight. But there are some moments that were a little difficult. And I was like, I don't want to experience that again. In the same way that I don't know that I would replay the Samus Returns remake, which I liked, because it was just a little long and a little repetitive. But that's based on the original game, which was a little long and a little repetitive. And so I think whereas Metroid Fusion, because of how streamlined each section is, and while it's Metroidvania in each area, the narrative is pretty linear, it felt approachable to go back to it in a way that the other games may or may not. And I think that's an interesting thing as well about replayability when we're looking at it, is like your personal favorites and what you like about a game can come into it, as well as external forces. Like I replayed Jedi Fallen Order last year because the PS5 update came out for it, and I had the PS4 version on disc, which means you get that update for free. So I replayed it. And I was excited about Jedi Survivor, which just came out. And when I replayed it, I could have just played the beginning and be like, oh, it looks really great, I'm done, like I did with Witcher 3, which I do want to play again, but the game's 1,000,000 hours long. But with Jedi Fallen Order, I got sucked back into the story again. I got sucked back into why I loved the game in the first place. And so it was very easy for me to replay it. And again, it's not a perfect video game. And there are collectibles and stuff in that, mostly ponchos. But that wasn't what made me want to replay it. It was my initial love of the game. And I think ultimately, the first thing we're talking about is at the core, we replay games because we like them, because we love them. You're not going to replay a game you don't like, unless you're giving it a second chance or something.
Absolutely. And it is very funny that the length of a game really doesn't seem to have much bearing on its replayability. You'd think that, I spent 100 hours on this game. Am I really starting another save file? Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes, yes. And sometimes there's a 2-hour game, a 15-minute game. You play it once, that's enough, either for the story experience or the effect it has on you. And sometimes you just want to rack them up and start playing again, no matter how long it takes. I've definitely done a lot of runs through Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Not because it's fast, not because it's easy, not because whatever, but yeah, because it's one I love. And because Metroidvanias have a certain amount of replayability baked into them because of wanting to fill in the map again or wanting to find this thing again. I feel like two genres that immediately came to mind when we decided to talk about replayability were Metroidvanias and roguelikes. And roguelikes are another one where you get a little bit nebulous sometimes as to what counts as replaying it. Do you need to get to the end of the run in order to say you're replaying it? Or is that inherent one more game, one more run kind of feeling choosing to replay it, choosing to re-engage with it? Hades, at this point, I feel okay saying, you have to reach the summit 10 times before you can say you've beaten the game.
And technically, you still haven't finished the narrative. You have to do it another 10 times after that.
There you go. So if you've done it 20 times, have you beaten the game once? Have you done 20 successful runs amongst potentially hundreds of other runs that didn't reach the top there? Or not? This is that question.
Yeah. And I think that for replayability as a concept, I assume, though I've never been in the room, that when classic games were coming out, they did talk about it a little, right? We want people to come back to games. But between rentals and other things and the expensive games and that games at the time seemingly were only for children, even though that wasn't even really true back then, there were a lot of factors that I think those companies didn't think about at that age where they do now. I mean, think about the life of an MMO, right? Replayability. Technically, when you beat an expansion, the narrative ends. You can even roll credits. But that doesn't mean you've beaten the game, ? Right? Or think about modern Pokemon games. All modern Pokemon games have a post-game. But like for Arceus's narrative didn't end until you completed the Pokedex, which most of the games didn't do that. You finish the narrative and then you can finish the Pokedex in the post-game. In fact, most of the time you can't catch them all before you beat the story. And those kinds of things also, I think, lead to people wanting to replay games or just sticking with games and their longevity. And I think there's an evolved conversation beyond this about the longevity of certain games. But like, I've also found that there are certain things that games clearly do to increase replayability. You think about massive online games like Fortnite and adding different skins. And like, that's a free-to-play game. So the difference there is they're trying to keep you playing that game by adding stuff so you'll spend money and stay there. But then you think about games like I mentioned Jedi Survivor earlier, there are a lot of Metroidvania-likes and roguelikes and adventure games that give you customization options, look, style, whatever else, because they want you to go, well, this looks awesome. I want to play through the game with this thing. I mean, think about Dead Rising, the original Dead Rising. Like, you could get all these costumes, all these different things. You could look like a Servbot in serious cutscenes, and it was the best. But then I think you unlock certain weapons that didn't exist in certain gameplay modes after beating it. Like, I think that game design from the PlayStation 2 on was thinking about how to keep people replaying their games so they stick with it. On the other hand, I feel like corporations also sometimes are like, well, how can we make this a tight and quick experience so people really love it and then they buy the next thing that we offer? I think it can go both ways, but I feel like most games these days are leaning into trying to keep people playing their games for as long as possible, as often as possible.
It's games as service.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, the older games, it wasn't necessarily an idea of how do we increase replayability. It's put another quarter in. You are designing with arcade ideas in mind. You make the games extremely difficult because, yeah, the kids only got 3 cartridges, or they're going to be banging their head against the wall to try to get through this because that's what games were at the time. Yeah. Yes, there were RPGs. Yes, there were those. But a lot of them in the 80s were computer games, were PC games. And so console gaming ideas, which is sort of what we're talking about here, I know that has spread over time, but this kind of concept is very much baked into that. Whereas now you have the freedom to make the game as long or as short as you'd like. And so you have to make those decisions. If not deliberately, the decisions are made.
Yeah.
And MMOs and games as services or life simulator games or just games that are built as sandboxes or your Minecrafts or anything like that, that also have the like, just keep coming back. We've added a new device. We've added a new block. We've added a new skin. We've added a new thing. Rack them up, play it again. But also anything with multiplayer and with the internet evolving as it has over the decades, you can make a game way more replayable by adding other people.
Yeah.
If it's a multiplayer game, it's the same concept. We're back to that sports analogy for arcade style titles. The game's different every time because humans are involved versus a single player experience through something programmed, even with fantastic AI, even with a hilarious physics engine. And sometimes games, whether through skins, through updates, through whatever else, encourage you to go in and, well, play around. There's plenty of times where I've replayed a game. I wouldn't necessarily call it a challenge run, but I would call it a fuck around and find out run. A lot of games don't do this as much these days, but it still happens. Things are unlocked when you complete the game. A lot of times now, indie games are the ones in the realm of like, you complete this, you've unlocked this character. Beat Shredder's Revenge, you unlock Casey Jones.
Right.
Beat Resident Evil 2 enough times, you unlock a block of tofu. And playing through Metal Gear Solid, the original on PS1, I beat it with both endings so that I could get the bandana, I could get the stealth camo. When I got the stealth camo, I just played a run where I wanted to see what I could get away with in the game. Did you know you could plant C4 literally on the guards if you sneak up to them?
That's amazing.
Because I found that out, and I tell you, you could set up multiple of those, and, this was my Untitled Goose Game of 1998, just running around and blowing up guards in the tank hangar. And you know what? No one called me and scolded me about that level of violence. They were very mad when I shot the rats, though. I feel like there should be a conversation here. But this was testing the limits of what they put into the game. And that's what got me playing the game again, because it enticed me with, all right, if I do this, I'll get a weird conversation. If I do this, that provokes a unique reaction. And so some games have that baked in, and some are more open sandbox games, open physics games, or ones that have more sophisticated reactions or dialogue options put in there. I mean, really, how many runs of Disco Elysium can you do before you have a perfectly duplicated run again?
Yeah, I imagine it would take many. And that's a good point, too. Obviously, it's comical at this point how many times I've played the Mass Effect trilogy. And that comes from, a love of the game, right? I think a lot of the replayability Geoff and I specifically are going to speak to when talking about personal experience is going to be how much we love said game, because I think that's inherent. But Mass Effect encouraged it because of all the options, the different romances, especially leading up to the third game. I haven't played the third game as many times because I was initially disappointed with it, though I've come around on it. Mm-hmm. But the lead up to it, I played 1 and 2 8 times. I needed 2 good shepherds, 2 bad shepherds, and then so 4 times. And then I played through again to do all the different classes. And so if the game wasn't good, of course I wouldn't have replayed it, but also the diversity in the class you can be, how you can make your character look, the types of choices you can make, the characters you can interact with, the things that you can do, the DLC they added, all of that encourages the replayability of that game. Since then, I have not replayed it as much because I just haven't had the time, but I did play that a lot back then when I was in college because I had the time and because I was very obsessed with the game, and I played less games on the whole. I think also interestingly about the conversation about liking a game or not. Loving a game, even a game being a favorite, doesn't always inherently mean it's replayable. I'll give you an example. I loved Citizen Sleeper, my favorite game of that year. I really enjoyed it. But when I got my ending, that ending felt canonical. It felt complete. I've hesitated to go back to the DLC, which I do want to play, because I don't want to just pick up that run. I'd have to start a new run, and to start from the beginning, it's not a terribly long game, but I'm like, do I want to start from the beginning? Well, if I do, then what do I want to pick? There was just something very complete and canonical about that playthrough. A similar thing happened in Mass Effect where my Femme Shepherd was, for a long time, my canonical Shepherd until we did Reignite, and I did one more based on myself. But Citizen Sleeper is a game that I really love and I will go back to and I will play the DLC. But I've hesitated all this time because I was so satisfied with the ending. It just felt done. It felt complete.
Yeah, I've I was talking about this yesterday. To go outside video games for a moment, I was talking about theater, about plays and musicals and things. And there are plays and musicals you walk out of that are just feel good. You're quoting the lines, you're humming the tunes, you're recommending it to people. And then there's ones that are just sort of, that was incredible. I am going to be thinking about that for a while. I am changed. I am whatever. Should I go see it? I'm not going to see it again. It's good. It's incredible. I needed it once versus
Right.
I've definitely gone to some musicals more than once. Not so much these days, but definitely during my high school, college, rushing theater for $10, $20 phase. Oh, I would rewatch shows all the time. And were some of them my favorite shows? No, but I watched them. On video games, yes, I have replayed the original Katamari Damacy far more often than I've replayed its sequel, We Love Katamari, which is probably out of the whole series my favorite of them. But the original is the one that I've played the most, the one that's most easy to start a new file and fill it up.
Yeah.
And that just feels good on its own as well.
Yeah.
And to go back to Mass Effect for a moment, it also scratches a different itch that is another reason I think, certainly for me, I would replay a game. Because yes, you could do different story paths. You know, am I actually going to romance somebody else? Who's to say? Different gameplay choices. Metal Gear Solid is an example of that. Hitman or Grand Theft Auto. There's a lot of different ways to go about achieving this objective. Same goes for Mass Effect. But also, you can have specific styled runs.
Yeah.
Things like in Dark Souls or Elder Scrolls or Diablo, where you go, I'm playing this class and I'm going to do this kind of a run. Can I play through this entire game without picking up a weapon? Can I be horribly evil? Can I do this entirely with poison skills? Can I win the game with a hammer? Whatever it is. Is it a challenge run? Possibly, sometimes. But it's those, I'm going to go through this gameplay experience, this story experience, following whatever specific path, whether that is build, gameplay, story, whatever that is. It's choosing a new perspective on it as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that the only game that can come anywhere close to Mass Effect for replays for me is Skyrim. And that's because Skyrim was so customizable and you could do so many different things that I played it once as an orc barbarian, then I played it again as a werewolf, then I played it again as a vampire when the vampire DLC came out, and then I played it again with a monk mod on PC that allowed me to fist fight. But then, like we talked about in our episode with Rachel Cohort, when I go back to Skyrim now, because of all of those things I have done, I overthink what I'm going to do. And so now I'm less likely to replay it. But that kind of leads me to another branch of this. I'm also less likely to replay stuff now because I have limited time. And this is not a woe is me, I have too many games to play for my awesome podcast. Although that's part of it. But also, I have less time in the day. I work a 40-hour-a-week day job, plus doing all the podcasting and production and editing that I do. And the time to play games is just limited and is often my downtime. And so where I had that space to play Chrono Trigger once a year, now that space is filled with other things that I'm working on that I choose to work on. But it's like I'm at this point now, as of when we're recording, which will give you a little bit of a timeline. I am trying as quick as possible without rushing it to get through Jedi Survivor, because the release of Tears of the Kingdom is imminent. And I know the minute a new Zelda game comes out, all bets are off on any other game I was playing. And so as an adult with lack of time or choosing to spend our time differently, it's just hard to play a video game all the time whenever I want. I also have a spouse and a puppy and other responsibilities even outside of work and podcasting. And so like I get maybe a couple of hours a night, not every night either, because what if I'm playing D&D? What if I'm going to a game night or going to see a movie?
Yep.
And so because there are so many things, whereas a kid, when your responsibility is school and that's it, mostly, depending on how fortunate you are or whatever. But if you have the means to play games and you don't have a lot of other hobbies, you can fill a lot of that time. Again, I played through Mass Effect like 8 times, 1 and 2, because at that point when I was in college, I took most of my classes on 2 days. I had a day job that was definitely not 40 hours a week. It was a part-time job. And so I filled the rest of that time with just playing Mass Effect. I wasn't playing other games. But because of this podcast in particular, but also Reignite, because I'm replaying something for that. And then just my broader love of games, right? I'm less focused on one kind of game or one game specifically. because my tastes have broadened and the games I want to play has broadened and the indie scene has ballooned since we were kids as well. There is still shovelware, but there's less shovelware and more indies now. And I just want to play all of it, and you can't play all of it. Like, I started Octopath Traveler 2, a game that I am truly loving, but I'm 20 hours in, and I may not go back to after Tears of the Kingdom because I still haven't finished Persona 5, which is also 100 hours. And so, like,
yes, it is.
As we are recording, also Final Fantasy 16 is imminent. It's months away, a month away. Fuck.
Oh my God, you're right.
And like in June, that comes out, and it's the most excited I've been for a Final Fantasy game in a while at launch. And so I'm going to play that. And that's at least going to be 50 or 60 hours. There's no way that is under 30 hours. No way in hell.
Nope.
Like, this sounds like I'm complaining, but I think it's more just a realization that if I want to replay something, it has to really get me at the right time or literally overpower me, in the sense that, like, when Metroid Fusion came to NSO, I played it because it's one of my favorite games of all time. And I was like, it's only 5 hours long. I have to replay it.
Yeah, it's a good opportunity to revisit something that you love.
Right. And I think that importance is going to outweigh a lot of stuff in adulthood that it may not have even been in consideration growing up.
Yeah. When Nintendo Switch Online first came out, at whatever point Crystalis became available on it, I put everything aside and I beat the game. Took me a couple hours, didn't take that long. I can't quite speed run it, but I'm pretty fast. It took me about an hour and a half. But it was like, well, now's the time to do it. Like, let me try it in this context. Let me enjoy it in this context. Because a game's replayability is nothing on whether it's a good game, a bad game, a memorable game, an important game, any of that. It simply is a factor of the game. If it's a game that's built to be arcade style and it's not replayable, that's a little bit more of a problem. A slightly more obscure-ish game, or one that hasn't been talked about in a very long time. I was a big fan of Solomon's Keep and Solomon's Boneyard on iOS. And Solomon's Boneyard is, before there was Vampire Survivors, there was stuff like this. And it's in that vein, really. And so if you only wanted to do one run of Solomon's Boneyard and you're done, the game failed you. But if you only want to play through Chrono Trigger once, if you only want to play through Jedi Fallen Order once, it's not a failure of the game. But it does lend one to wonder or question, like, about our gaming habits, about our timing, about everything else. And yeah, I enjoy that a lot of indie games now, they are as long as they need to be. A game is 5 minutes long, it's 5 minutes long. A game is 50 hours long, it's 50 hours long. And you can choose to re-engage with that however you like, or you can feel satisfied having beaten it. Or, again, you can go back to questioning the nature of art. When are you done with Stanley Parable? When are you actually starting a new game? Or when are you just continuing to engage with this bonkers narrative?
We're always in Stanley Parable. Forever.
Yes.
Constantly.
Always with Stanley.
Well, yeah, sure. And I think also to that end, though, replayability on the opposite end, games try and find it even in ways that we couldn't have even imagined growing up. Because everything is online now and everything's connected, games that don't have a subscription still release free updates. I think about Boyfriend Dungeon released an extra dungeon and new romances. Very recently, we mentioned it before on the show, Infernax released a multiplayer mode. Like, because your games don't require to be done and never touched again like they used to, you can add and patch in and develop new things and expansions that you can charge for or not charge for, but that will build out the game or bring people back to the game. I think about Sonic Frontiers, which I absolutely loved at the end of last year, flaws and all. I didn't uninstall it after finishing it like I normally would with a single player experience, because they rolled out their release calendar for all of the free DLC they're going to include, including bonus characters and bonus stories. I'm like, oh, well, I'll keep it on my hard drive for when that stuff comes out. Whereas when I finished Like a Dragon Ishin, I uninstalled it because I love the Yakuza franchise, but it'll be a while before I revisit this game, if I revisit it at all, because they don't typically do that kind of DLC, at least not in the past that I'm aware of.
Right.
And so it's one of those things that now in modern gaming, there are reasons to go back to games and replay them. Like I said before, I replayed Fallen Order. I was probably going to anyway because I was so excited for the game. But I also replayed it because I got that free update for the PS5 version. You know, I wanted to see how much prettier it was, that kind of thing. And so I think those kinds of things are very different now that we didn't even consider at one point, because we live in an internet age while we're always connected, whereas there are downsides to that. This is a much brighter side of the fact that game companies that finished a game and you can play it, they still had other ideas. They can bring those ideas to fruition later, which bring you back to those games.
Yeah, absolutely. And a word that I keep orbiting around that I didn't want to say, but I feel like just sums it up is like craving a game.
Yeah.
And there's different ways of going about that, whether it's you crave seeing the end of the game, you crave having all of it, or you are just yearning to engage in its gameplay at all times. Something that brings me back to Metroidvanias is there is a delight in finding the thing, unlocking the door. Once I know where everything is, there's a new delight in achieving that and conquering it. Roguelikes, there's that definite crave of a one more game kind of feel. I played Dead Cells for the first time, finally, this past weekend at a friend's place, and they had the Castlevania DLC. I was enjoying Dead Cells. Then I got to the Castlevania section, and I just went, you bastards came for me specifically. How dare you?
Yeah.
And yeah, no, I am craving that game in that way. To do one more run, to see as much as I can see, to unlock everything that I can. You know, Dead Cells is a roguelike Metroidvania. I am in trouble. This is fine. And that's where arcade-style things come from. Puzzle games, it's that, like, I can do better this time. Or I can try something different. Or, ooh, I learned a new thing while playing. Let me try that. And story games, you sometimes want to see the story with new eyes. All the twists and turns have happened. Where was all the foreshadowing? Or how would I play this differently? Would I use that character in my party knowing they're going to leave me under whatever circumstances they are?
Mm-hmm.
Or what can I do with them with the brief time that I have them? I didn't really use them that much, but oh dang, they were kind of cool. I think there's an interesting, nebulous, but definite notion in the craveability of a game, of its gameplay experience, of its gameplay loop, of its story beats too, and how that affects each and every one of us. There's a reason I don't play Civilization, because if I ever got a craving for a 4X game, none of you would see me again.
Yeah, that's
no one.
Geoff would disappear into his own civilization.
I would lose my reflection. I would not see me again.
You'd become the John Cena of video games.
Yes, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, well, sure. I mean, that craveability, though, that intangible, I mean, I think hype and excitement for a game leads into that. But, like, again, my love of Mass Effect, I played that game not even knowing what it was and ended up falling in love with it. On the opposite end, I mentioned Boyfriend Dungeon earlier. That was a game I'd been looking forward to for so long. And then it finally came out, and it lived up to my expectations. I don't know if it lived up to everyone's expectations, but it absolutely lived up to mine. And I loved it so much, I played it twice in a row, which is so rare for me to replay a game immediately. The last time I did that was Batman Arkham City. When I finished it, I immediately replayed it.
Nice. That's a good one for that.
Like those kinds of games. And like Boyfriend Dungeon is another one that I played twice back to back, once on PC and then once on Switch. And then I replayed it again after that because I just felt like it. And then the DLC came out and I started another replay. And I think that like is so specific to me, and I'm sure a bunch of other folks, but I think what leads to that is, I mean, the length helps, right? Like short games, I am definitely more likely to replay than long games.
Of course.
I tried to start a new save of The Witcher for the PS5 version when I remembered how long that game took me to finish it, just skipping all the side quests and just playing the main content and still not having played the DLC. I went, no, I'm good. I found out recently, though, that you can play the DLC without replaying the game. Like they give you just a version of Geralt that you can start with that's of level for the DLC, which is actually pretty neat and might get me to go play that. That said, there are other long games that I have come back to and went, like Fallen Order is not a long game, but it's not a short game either. I think it's about 20 hours, just like the new one. And like I chose to spend that time playing that game, right? One of the reasons I fell off the new God of War, even though I loved the first one, the 2018 one, I fell off because I kept hearing how long it was and other games came out. Will I go back to it? Probably. Will it be anytime soon? Highly unlikely. I think ultimately, at the end of the day for me, and what I think a lot of people replaying games now is, you know, it's that old thing. I want shorter games with worse graphics made by less people, like for less money,
better.
That are way better. And so, like, I think there's a lot of that in my life, and things that will get me to replay stuff is the fact that the game is shorter, is accessible, whatever it is. And it's interesting to look at that, whereas what the industry considers replayable, which is like all of the bajillion collectibles in Jedi Survivor, which, yes, you can make Cal look like a hillbilly, and it might be fun to play as a hillbilly Jedi. And it has a new Game Plus mode, as far as I know, but I'm not even going to engage with that probably anytime soon. But like those kinds of things are things the industry considers make stuff replayability. Sometimes that matches up with what the person playing the game feels like makes it replayable, but sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, I don't need to get every collectible in Donkey Kong 64.
Oh, God.
I barely need to play Donkey Kong 64, but it's in my house. And because it's in my house, it taunts me. And there is a very funny thing, actually, speaking of that, where sometimes you start a new run on a game and you go, this time will be different. I was referencing romancing before, but I also mentioned Diablo 2. And I played so much Diablo 2 in the early 2000s. I would multiplayer with some of my friends all of the time. And there were classes that I played once. And then there was the Necromancer. And I'd be like, I'm going to try curses. I inevitably would make a Necromancer that maxed out Corpse Explosion. Because you know what? I love that skill. And there's just something very fun about going through Act 2 in narrow hallways. You get one guy down. And then it's just cheesy 2001 pixelated blood effects just exploding everywhere. And what does that say about me? I don't know, but it was fun.
I mean, well, I had that same experience with Diablo 2 with the expansion. Like, once the expansion came out, all I did was play a werewolf druid. And to me,
I knew it.
And for the werewolf druid, I was the wolf druid. I had werewolf form, I had summon wolves, and like every time I would replay that game with friends, I'd be like, this time I'm going to make an elemental druid and I'm going to do spells. And inevitably, I'd get like halfway down the spell tree and then I'd go, but what if I had summon wolves? But what if I had werewolf?
Just a little wolf as a treat. Playing the sorceress, I could be convinced to do any element.
Right.
I think my favorite was lightning because I just like lightning in any game. That would be my favorite. But I could go any which way. Necromancer would inevitably Corpse Explosion would, like, I could do other things. I'm blowing stuff up. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I mean, well, yeah. And you talked about it with the romance stuff. Like, the reason I make fun of Frankie so much on our Mass Effect playthrough is because I knew they were going to romance Garrus again. Because
they can't not.
They can't not. You know, whereas I romance different characters because I don't know that I played. Again, my canonical Shepherd wasn't based on me. It was based on a character I created. And so it was a very different thing for me. But like, it's just funny because there are tons of folks who do that with the BioWare games. Like, I want to romance someone different. Oh no, I've fallen in love with Dorian again in Dragon Age Inquisition.
Because you're going through that whole tens of hours experience and you're having those same experiences with those characters. Whether you bring them in your party because you like having them there and that's just like, oh, but how could I? No, I have to.
Yeah.
And it's so funny and it's so wonderfully human of us. I love it.
And yet it doesn't stop us from wanting to replay them again, right? We just know we're going to do the same thing. I mean, a friend of the show, Kenneth Shepard, has never romanced anyone but Caden Nolenko because he is a gay man, and that's the only person you can romance, well, besides someone they introduced in the third game as a gay man, but also that's his favorite.
But from the first game.
Right. That's his favorite, and so that's who he romances in the third game. And romances no one before. And like, same thing with Dragon Age. Like, the couple times he's played Inquisition, he romances Dorian because Dorian is his favorite. And like, I get that. Yeah. And it's funny how being creatures of habit and having preferences, I mean, I guess that's what we're saying is like all of replayability kind of at the end of the day for the individual person boils down to preferences, because whatever the game industry is throwing at you is like, this is why this game is replayable. Ultimately, you brought up Shredder's Revenge earlier, a game that should be infinitely replayable, and I've only beaten it like twice because I liked it and it was fun because it was more fun with friends. I haven't really gone back to it because unless I schedule time to sit down and play with all my friends, which is difficult enough as it is, I just felt no reason to go back to it. Meanwhile, the Scott Pilgrim game, which I have on almost every platform now that they re-released it, I've played multiple times in multiple places because it's one of my favorite games. I think while logic would defy us to go in direction A, sometimes we go in direction B for things that the games industry, the developers, and anyone else couldn't have predicted.
Yeah, and I think, you know what, I hesitated to use the word, but I think craving is kind of the big one here. Even in the same way where folks sometimes don't necessarily have much of a sweet tooth, but sometimes they just really need something, or you forget that you really like this one band, and then you hear something of theirs, you go, oh, God damn it, I love these guys. Oh, my God. And, you know, I haven't played Slay the Spire in a little while, but I'm sure if I did a run, you'd lose me for a good weekend.
Yeah.
And I'd have a great time, and I would throw myself into that and do probably more deck builder roguelikes, because there's a bunch of those. What a wonderful problem. And even talking about it right now, I'm not like, can we end this episode so I can go, be the Ironclad? But
yeah, but you mentioning it just now gave me the itches, and I'm like, oh God, no, I've got to play the game. God damn it.
Yeah, there it is. That's the nice thing about there being so many games. Sometimes you can just sort of bury the crave for a moment, and then you're like, wait a minute. And there is that thing where it's nice to be able to walk away from a game for a little while, find new things, have new experiences, and then, come back and go, it's time. Let's see that story again. Let's have that sequence. Let's lose 1,000 times to this one boss, because that's part of the experience too. And the game over screen can sometimes count as the credits as far as doing a run.
I'm curious, do you have a clear vision of the game you've replayed the most?
I've been thinking about it this whole time. I would say Castlevania Symphony of the Night is up there. That's one where I started just making up challenge runs for myself.
Right.
There's probably some NES games that I have played nigh unto infinite.
Does the Ninja Turtles game for Nintendo count because we all replayed it to the dam many times and never got past it?
Yeah, there's nothing after the dam. The dam's
That's the end of the game.
You save the dam, the game's over. You go home. Right? As soon as it got in, it said, I'm home, I turned the game off. I assumed we were done. Nothing comes after? Exactly. But yeah, there's definitely a bunch of those. I probably played through Manhattan Project an awful lot on the NES. Kirby's Adventure might be one that even the idea of new file, let's go, 100% that, let's make that happen. Kirby's Adventure might be up there. Several Mario titles. I recently came into a bunch of SNES cartridges, including Super Mario World, and there was a blank file on it. I'm not that far into it, but the crave is coming back to get 96 exits. So I'll probably think of some others in 20 minutes after we're done recording, but those are some of the hits. I'll bring it up on Twitter later.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I mentioned a bunch of the Mass Effect 1 and 2, Chrono Trigger, but yeah, same for me, a bunch of those Nintendo games, like the Turtles 2 arcade game for NES, I played through from front to back many times. The original Super Mario Brothers, I played through front to back, either doing all the worlds and then sometimes just skipping all the way to the 8th world. Mario Brothers 3 growing up was probably the one I played the most, because that one was easiest difficulty-wise for me to get from front to back and started my love of replaying Mario games. Mario 64, I did a side quest on it. That game, since it came out, has been one of my video game obsessions. And then, like I said, more recently, Boyfriend Dungeons, I've done a lot. Metroid Fusion, I've done a lot since the day it came out. Those games, I think, are all ones that I've replayed a bunch. There are games that I finished in the last few years that I'd like to replay. Metroid Dread is on that list. I can feel myself wanting to replay Jedi Survivor already. There will definitely be games like that. I have one game that's the anti-replay game, and that's Breath of the Wild. Loved it.
Yeah.
Never need to play it again. It was incredible, but I've been hearing people talk about how I got to replay Breath of the Wild before Tears of the Kingdom. I was like, no, thank you. Too much. Do
you though?
Yeah. Those Korok seeds. If I see another fucking Korok seed,
you're gonna.
I know, but I think those are the gist. Zelda is a good one. I've replayed Link to the Past more times than I can probably count.
The original, I've played a lot. Yeah.
I think for me, the modern games, there are less that I've replayed a lot. There are some, but classic games, because they were the handful of games we had, I've replayed them more. And I'm sure, like Geoff, I will think of others. Again, Diablo 2, we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, Diablo 2 is definitely one. For me, an obscure one is the Game Gear version of Aladdin.
Oh, for me, it's the Game Gear Sonic game, Triple Trouble. I've played so many times.
Yeah. We need to talk about the 16-bit version that somebody made recently on a future episode. I'm putting that down now.
Yeah, definitely. But also probably Kirby's Dream Land. I've played the most of any Kirby game because it's about a half hour long. You can get through most of the game in a half hour, and then it lets you replay it on a harder difficulty, and I've done that a bunch too. Yeah. There are games that are on my replay wish list. I want to replay the newest Kirby game that came out on the Switch because I really enjoyed it, but I have to, make the time like anything else. There are so many games that I've replayed because I do like revisiting stuff, but it has become a less frequent thing with all media, not just games, as I've gotten older, just purely due to time.
Yeah, it's rough. And as an endlessly distractible human, I have lived every single day that experience of spending the runtime of a movie trying to decide what movie to watch and then finding I don't have enough time to watch a movie.
Yeah.
That happens to me a lot. I'll definitely have times where I'm home alone in the evening. I'm like, I'm going to play whatever damned game I want. And inevitably, whenever I get around to deciding what game I'm playing, and I have that like, do I just replay a comfort game just so I'm playing games? No, let me play something new. I've got a huge backlog. I'm an idiot. I need to play some of these games. When I finally sit down and start playing, this is how I will determine that Sarah will be getting home in 15 minutes, whatever it is. But usually that makes some progress. So I just play games I can save.
Right, yeah.
New solution.
For me, currently, it's whatever game I'm actively playing to cover on one thing or another. But then there are games that sometimes I'll go, I've got a couple hours. Why don't I just dive into this thing or try and make progress on that thing? But I've been the same.
Yeah, I started Vagrant Story a few weeks ago. What the hell was I thinking?
Of course you did.
Yeah, I did. Never played it before.
But yeah, I mean, I'm curious what our listeners think as far as replayability, only because some of the listeners that I know personally, like I know some of them are very much like I'm one and done, and others are like, well, I got to replay this thing. I mean, Dave, I know you're listening because you've got a podcast that's about playing games. Like I know you've been replaying a bunch of games that you love for Tales of the Backlog while still playing new games. So like I'm
work versus pleasure though, as far as replaying the games.
Right. And so like that's always something I'm curious about too, because I don't always replay games that I cover on side quests, and then others I do. Like, so I'm just curious, like, what are some of your favorite games to replay? Are there games that we haven't even considered that you would love to replay? Are there reasons you replay games that we didn't even talk about? All of these things are valid questions.
Yeah, we did not even touch on space sim games at any point in any reason. Well, the main reason is I don't think either of us play a bunch of them, so we can't speak that well to them. But those are definitely up for debate of, are you endlessly replaying or are you just endlessly playing?
Yeah.
What does replayability mean for you? What is it that makes you want to replay a game? How long do you take between replays of long games, short games, arcade games, hard games? Have you started coming up with weird challenge runs for playing through games that you love to play? I've definitely tried to do low-level and equipmentless runs of Symphony of the Night, and those are still saved, and I think I completed them. I don't remember. Maybe I go back to it. Maybe I'm replaying it again. Who's to say? But we want to hear from you on this one, and there's so many different ways for you to get in touch with us and let us know. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at funandgamespod. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. You can go to certainpov.com and find not only a permanent invite link to our Discord server where these discussions do continue, but you can also find a lot of other fantastic Certain POV shows. And a great way to support the show is just coming on and having these chats with us and letting us know these things, letting us know what we missed, letting us know what you thought of this episode, what you'd like us to talk about in future episodes, or who you'd like us to talk to in future episodes as well. Another great way to support us or continue that sort of line of discussion and conversation is on our Patreon, patreon.com/funandgamespod. If you want to support us in that way, is greatly appreciated, or you can put yourself up on the high scoreboard. We'd like to shout out everyone up on the high scoreboard today: Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Needon, Alejandro Alves, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Rob Tremarco, Robert Proin, and Sean Bowen. Thank you so much. Please enter your initials. It's going to have a little bit of a fun effect on when you start the game again, but you're going to have to look for where your initials show up.
If all of that stuff that Geoff said was impossible to remember and you've already forgotten, you can just go to our show notes. We include links to our social media, to the Discord server, to our Patreon, and to all the places you can rate and review us in the show notes. Please do write us a review on Apple Podcasts or rate us on Spotify. You only have to listen for about 30 seconds, even if Spotify is not your platform of choice, and then it will let you rate us. All of that helps us to get featured on all of those platforms, as well as help people discover the show. We love growing this audience, and rating and reviewing us is the best way to do it. If you are overseas and you rate and review us, if you are not in the US, if you want to send us an email and let us know, that's great, because we can't always see ratings and reviews from other countries. And folks have done that in the past, and we really appreciate it.
We absolutely do. And speaking of replayability, do you ever replay any of our episodes? What's your favorite episode to replay? I want to know. Please. I didn't mean to go quite so weird on that one, but I don't care. Let me know one way or the other, because, damn it, this is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Hey.
Oh, hey, Geoff.
What's going on, guys?
Oh, talking about Superman.
Oh, cool. I could talk about Superman.
I could talk some more about Superman.
We know.
I'll bet a few people would want to get in on this.
I'm down.
You know it.
That sounds like fun. I'll do it.
Cool, let's do it. We can call the show Men of Steel.
And you can find it at certainpov.com.
Or wherever you get your podcasts.
Yay!
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.